That is one of the most 90s things I have ever seen. Still better than the Sega Saturn commercials, that's for sure. Alright, so the PlayStation was one of the big consoles that was going around during the 3D revolution, which is where developers were breaking away from the 2D games of old and trying to bring everything into the third dimension. It was a time of tremendous experimentation, and because of that, a lot of games at the time tend to not hold up terribly well. Some developers were wise enough to cut their teeth on simpler games in order to get a grasp of 3D game design. And one of the easiest ways to do that was to do a racing game. That's probably why when Psychosis came along and started brainstorming ideas for a PlayStation 1 game, they settled on a racing game. However, they didn't want to just do a basic racing game. That was already covered on the PlayStation with stuff like Need for Speed and Ridge Racer. So what they settled on was a futuristic racer, and what became of that was, of course, the Wipeout series, one of Sony's longest-running racing franchises, and big fan favorites. Another game that has unfortunately become neglected in recent years. So, Wipeout takes place in the year, what was it again? 2052, and centers around a new type of racing called zero gravity racing, which is basically where zero gravity hovercraft race across specially designed tracks and try to vie for position while maintaining a high speed and avoiding the weapons from other racers. It might sound a lot like F-Zero, but Psychosis came up with a lot of interesting ways to set the game apart from F-Zero. For starters, whereas F-Zero is very over the top with superheroes, bounty hunters, supervillains, and a bunch of other weirdos making out the race roster, Wipeout feels more like a real-life racing league with subdued teams, sponsors, and all that stuff. It feels like a racing organization that could exist in reality, which doesn't make it quite as interesting as F-Zero, I would say, but it does give the game its own unique feel. And that is also evident in its general aesthetic and its soundtrack, which, as you're listening to right now, has a very techno-pop feel to it, which goes really well with the racing action on screen. Very strong game for the time, runs very well, draw distance is pretty well done, enough to where it's not a hindrance like it is in a lot of other racing games at the time. Pretty good. The control is also really good as well. Much like F-Zero, it really does feel like there are no wheels attaching you to the ground. So when you go to turn, you find yourself sliding to the side ever so slightly. So as you're trying to find your line, making your way through the various tracks, you need to be sure you account for that if you want to stay off the walls. You also have weapons that you'll get by driving over these various paths, which you can use to either get ahead of the pack or blow them aside, depending on what you have. Or, yeah. So it's a pretty fun racing game, and it actually does do a really good job setting itself apart from F-Zero. However, there are a few issues with the first Wipeout. For starters, this is another PlayStation game where that was made before the dual analog control came out. So you're trying to play the game with the D-pad, and as someone who has played a lot of Wipeout games, it is so weird playing Wipeout like that. It just does not feel like the game was designed with that in mind. I'm also not a huge fan of the weapon system. Not necessarily because it's not functional, but more or less because it's hard to tell what weapon you have. All the weird symbols that they have to represent what weapon you have. It's not exactly clear what weapon you have, so that's a big problem as well. But still, Wipeout is still a pretty fun racing game, but it is once again a franchise that would get better with time. In regards to the games that followed, Psychosis would follow it up with Wipeout 2097, which is a improvement on the previous game on all fronts. The control's a lot better. You don't lose nearly as much speed when you bump into the walls this time. It's still got issues with the item system. It's still kind of hard to tell what you have. But overall, it's a much better game than the first game. And they would even branch out a little bit, making a Sega Saturn version of that game. And even making a Wipeout for the Nintendo 64 with Wipeout 64. Wipeout 64 was a poor choice in my opinion, because while Wipeout is good, it doesn't have anything on F-Zero X in my opinion, but that's beside the point. And I think Sony, realizing that they had their own futuristic racing franchise to compete with F-Zero, decided having it on another console was sort of counterproductive. So they would eventually lock the franchise and Psychosis down into an exclusivity deal for Wipeout 3, and from then on, any Wipeout games that would see release would be exclusive to Sony consoles. Wipeout 3 in particular is probably the best game that was, of these Wipeout games, that was on the original PlayStation. So if you can only play one game on the original PlayStation, that's the one I recommend the most. Sadly, with the release of Wipeout 2048 in, God, I can't even remember when that came out. That had to have been 2015, 2016, somewhere around in there. But despite this game being of an excellent quality, this was the last game that Psychosis would make before they went under. And though there would be one more Wipeout game with the Sublime Wipeout Omega Collection, which includes 2048 as well as Wipeout HD and another game I can't think of at the time. It, for whatever reason, didn't do too well, and there hasn't been another Wipeout game since. Again, with Sony focusing so much on, games that aren't really resonating with gamers like they used to, I don't know why they won't put some money into making a new Wipeout game. A racing game like this would be incredibly welcome on the PlayStation 5, especially with its capabilities. It could probably increase the speed to ludicrous levels. I would love to see that, but it's probably not going to happen, and they at least could try to re-release some of these games, but what are you going to do? But anyway, yeah, love the hell out of Wipeout. One of my favorites on the console. That's going to do it for this franchise, so join me tomorrow as we move on to the next game in the retrospective.